Once you hear this story, you'll never forget it. There are places in this world that hold secrets, not dark ones, but the kind that wait patiently to be discovered, like seeds buried beneath winter snow. Lighthouse Point was one of those places, perched on the edge of a rocky coastline in northern Maine. The old lighthouse had stood for over 100 years, its white tower weathered by salt and time, its light long extinguished. For a 73-year-old, Margaret Ellis, that lighthouse represented everything she'd lost and everything she'd been running from for the past 50 years. She stood now in the parking lot of the seaside motel, her silver hair catching the late afternoon sun, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel of her rental car. Through the windshield, she could see it's a lighthouse, standing sentinel against the Atlantic, exactly as she remembered it. Except now it was silent, dark, abandoned. Margaret hadn't planned to come back. In fact, she'd spent half a century making sure she never would. But 3 days ago, a letter had arrived at her home in Phoenix, forwarded from an address she hadn't lived at in 30 years. The envelope was yellowed with age, the handwriting achingly familiar. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a rusted key. The letter was from her brother, Thomas, who had disappeared without a trace in the summer of 1973. Thomas, who she'd mourned for 50 years. Thomas, who, according to this letter, had left something for her at the lighthouse, something she needed to find. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The ocean wind hit her immediately, carrying the scent of brine and seaweed. It smelled exactly like memory. She pulled her cardigan tighter and began walking toward the lighthouse, the key heavy in her pocket. The path was overgrown now, wild roses and beach grass reclaiming what had once been a well-maintained trail. Margaret moved slowly, her joints protesting the uneven ground, but her determination unwavering. With each step, the past grew louder. She was 23 the last time she'd walked this path. It was August, and the lighthouse keeper, old Mr. Winters, had invited the whole town to a farewell party. The lighthouse was being automated, he'd explained sadly. No need for keepers anymore. Progress, they called it. Thomas had been there that night. Her younger brother, 20 years old and full of restless energy, had stood on the rocks below the lighthouse, staring out at the endless ocean as if it held all the answers he was searching for. Margaret had watched him from above, sensing something was wrong, but too caught up in her own life to really see it. She was engaged to Robert, planning a wedding, dreaming of the future. 2 days later, Thomas was gone. His bed was empty, his belongings untouched, his car still parked outside their parents' house. The police searched for months. Dive teams combed the waters, but Thomas Ellis had simply vanished, as completely as morning fog. Margaret had blamed herself. She'd been too busy, too distracted, too wrapped up in her own happiness to notice her brother's pain. The guilt had followed her through 5 decades, 3 states, 2 marriages, and the birth of her own children. It had shaped every decision, colored every joy with a tinge of sorrow. And now, impossibly, there was this letter. The lighthouse door was padlocked, but the key in Margaret's pocket fit perfectly. The lock resisted at first, corroded by years of salt air, but finally gave way with a metallic groan. The door swung inward, revealing a dim interior that smelled of must and abandonment. Margaret stepped inside. The main room was surprisingly intact. Dust covered every surface like a gray blanket, but the furniture remained: an old desk, a bookshelf, a wooden chair. Afternoon light filtered through dirty windows, creating shafts of gold in the dimness. Everything was frozen in time, a museum of the past. On the desk lay another envelope, this one sealed with wax. Margaret's hands shook as she picked it up. The wax bore an impression: a simple lighthouse. She broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. "Dear Maggie," it began, using the nickname only Thomas had ever called her. "If you're reading this, then you found the first letter. I knew you would. You were always the persistent one." Tears blurred Margaret's vision, but she blinked them away and kept reading. "I'm writing this on August 15th, 1973, 2 days before I leave. I know what you're thinking, that I disappeared, that something terrible happened. But Maggie, I left on purpose. I had to. The world was too loud, too fast, too demanding. I felt like I was drowning on dry land. Every day was a struggle just to breathe, to smile, to pretend everything was okay, when inside I was falling apart. I'm not telling you this to hurt you or to make excuses. I'm telling you because I need you to understand. My leaving had nothing to do with you or mom or dad. It was about me, about a darkness I couldn't explain, couldn't escape. And I knew if I stayed, if I told anyone, they would try to fix me. But I wasn't broken, Maggie. I was just different. I needed something else, something simpler. So I left. I changed my name and moved to a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia. I became a fisherman. Can you believe it? Me, who used to get seasick on the ferry. But out there, on the water, I found peace. I found a rhythm that matched the one inside me. For the first time in my life, I could breathe. I wanted to tell you, God, Maggie, I wanted to tell you so many times. But years passed, and the longer I waited, the harder it became. How do you explain to someone you love that you chose to disappear? How do you ask for forgiveness for that kind of pain? I'm an old man now, 70 years old. Can you imagine? I've lived a good life, a quiet life. I never married, but I had friends. I had the ocean. I had peace. But I also had regret. Every single day, I regretted not saying goodbye, not letting you know I was okay. I'm sick now, Maggie. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months, and before I go, I need to do one last thing. I need to give you the truth. I need to give you closure. And most importantly, I need to ask for your forgiveness. There's more for you here, in this lighthouse. Climb the stairs to the top. What you find there is my gift to you, my explanation, my apology, and my love. The letter was signed simply, your brother, Tommy. Margaret sat down heavily in the wooden chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Thomas had been alive all these years, living, breathing, existing in the world while she mourned him. The revelation should have made her angry, should have filled her with rage at the wasted years, the unnecessary grief. But instead, she felt something unexpected, relief. He hadn't drowned. He hadn't suffered. He hadn't died alone and afraid. He'd found peace. After several minutes, Margaret stood and approached the spiral staircase that led to the top of the lighthouse. The metal steps were narrow and steep, and she climbed slowly, pausing frequently to catch her breath. With each step, the light grew brighter, streaming down from above. Finally, she reached a lamp room at the top. The space was circular, surrounded by windows that offered a breathtaking view of the ocean in every direction. The old lighthouse lamp stood in the center, its brass fittings dulled by time. But that wasn't what caught Margaret's attention. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, tacked up in careful rows, creating a mosaic of a life lived. Margaret moved closer, her breath catching in her throat. They were all pictures of her wedding day. Margaret in her white dress, radiant and young. Her first child being born, a blurry hospital photo, joy evident despite the exhaustion. Her daughter's graduation. Margaret in the crowd, clapping, proud. Her grandchildren's birthdays, holiday gatherings, ordinary moments, grocery shopping, gardening, reading on her porch. Thomas had been watching. All these years, he'd been keeping track of her life. She hadn't been alone in her memories. He'd carried her with him to In the center of the display was a larger photograph in a simple frame. It showed 2 children on a beach, Margaret and Thomas, maybe 8 and 5 years old, building a sandcastle together. Both were smiling, covered in sand and sunshine, and the unself-conscious joy of childhood. Margaret remembered that day. It was the summer, before everything got complicated, before the expectations and the pressure, before Thomas started struggling with the weight of the world. Beneath the frame was one final note. Maggie, I watched you live a beautiful life. I saw you marry Robert, raise 2 amazing kids, become a grandmother, find happiness even after the divorce, start over again. I saw you be brave when I couldn't be. I saw you choose to stay when I chose to run. And I was so proud of you. I know my leaving hurt you. I know it shaped your life in ways it shouldn't have. But please, Maggie, please don't let my mistake define your story. You've spent 50 years carrying guilt that was never yours to carry. It was mine, all mine. I'm gone now. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. But I want you to know that I died peacefully, surrounded by the sound of the ocean, thinking of you, thinking of that little girl who used to hold my hand on the beach and tell me we'd be friends forever. We were friends forever, Maggie. Distance doesn't change that. Time doesn't change that. I carried you with me every single day. You were my courage when I had none. You were my reminder that the world held goodness and light, even when I couldn't feel it myself. Forgive yourself, Maggie. You didn't fail me. You loved me, and that was enough. It was always enough. Live the rest of your life freely. Chase the sunsets. Dance when you hear music. Call your grandchildren more often. Take the trip you've been putting off. Fall in love again if you want to. Let go of the guilt and embrace the joy that's still waiting for you. Thank you for being my sister. Thank you for the memories. Thank you for existing. With all my love. From one lighthouse to another, Tommy Margaret sank to her knees among the photographs. 50 years of tears finally breaking free. She wept. For the lost time. For the words never spoken. For the brother she'd loved and lost and found again in the most impossible way. But she also wept with relief, with release, with the strange and complicated joy of finally understanding. Thomas hadn't left because of something she'd done or failed to do. He'd left because he was drowning and didn't know how else to save himself. And in his own way, by staying away, by living the life he needed to live, he'd saved himself. He'd found his peace. Now it was her turn. Now it was her turn. Margaret stayed in the lighthouse for hours, reading and rereading the letters, studying the photographs, connecting with her brother across the impossible distance of death and time. As the sun began to set, painting the ocean in shades of orange and gold, she made her way back down the spiral stairs. But before she left, she did one last thing. She found a piece of paper in the desk and wrote her own letter. Dear Tommy, I forgive you. More than that, I understand. And I promise to do what you asked. I'll let go of the guilt. I'll embrace the joy. I'll live the rest of my life freely, the way you found the courage to live yours. Thank you for the photographs. Thank you for watching over me. Thank you for coming back, even if only in letters and memories. I love you. I always have. I always will. Until we meet again, Maggie. She left the letter on the desk, anchored by a smooth piece of sea glass she found on the windowsill. Then she walked out of the lighthouse, locking the door behind her. The walk back to her car felt different, lighter. The weight she'd carried for 50 years had lifted, replaced by something softer, gratitude perhaps, or grace, or simply the knowledge that love doesn't end, it transforms. Over the next few days, Margaret did something she hadn't done in decades. She explored the town where she'd grown up. She visited the beach where she and Thomas had built sandcastles. She ate lobster rolls at the same diner they'd gone to as kids. She talked to old neighbors who remembered them both, sharing stories and laughter instead of sorrow. And she called her daughter, Emma, who she hadn't spoken to in months because of some silly argument she couldn't even remember now. Mom. Emma's voice was surprised. Is everything okay? Everything's wonderful, Margaret said, and meant it. I'm in Maine, at the old lighthouse. And Emma, I have a story to tell you, about your Uncle Tommy, about letting go, about starting over. Can I come visit you when I get home? I want to tell you in person. There was a pause, then Emma's voice, thick with emotion. I'd love that, Mom. I'd really love that. Margaret returned to Phoenix 3 days later, but she wasn't the same woman who'd left. The photographs from the lighthouse came with Herdemus, had left instructions for her to take them, to integrate his life into her own. She framed several and hung them in her home, not as monuments to grief, but as celebrations of connection. She also did something else. She signed up for a watercolor painting class she'd been putting off for years. She booked a trip to Ireland she'd always wanted to take. She started volunteering at a youth center, working with teenagers who were struggling, trying to be for them what she wished she could have been for Thomas's safe place, a listening ear, a light in the darkness. And every morning, she looked at the photograph of 2 children building sandcastles and remembered that love doesn't disappear. It just changes form. Sometimes it's a hand to hold. Sometimes it's a memory to cherish. And sometimes it's a letter waiting in an abandoned lighthouse, carrying a message across decades. Forgiveness, understanding, peace. 6 months after her trip to Maine, Margaret received a package from a lawyer in Nova Scotia. Inside was a small wooden box and a note explaining that these were Thomas's final belongings, left to her in his will. The box contained simple things: a compass, a fishing lure, a journal filled with sketches of seascapes, and one more photograph. This one showed an older man standing on a boat, the ocean stretching endlessly behind him, a small smile on his weathered face. On the back, in Thomas's handwriting, "I found my lighthouse, Maggie, now go find yours." Margaret kept that photograph on her bedside table, and every morning when she woke up, before the day began its demands, she looked at it and asked herself one question: what would bring me peace today? Sometimes the answer was a phone call to a friend she'd lost touch with, a difficult conversation she'd been avoiding, a dream she'd been too scared to chase. Sometimes it was a walk in the morning air, a moment to watch the sunset, an extra hug for her grandchildren. But always, always, she listened to the answer, and she acted on it, because that's what Thomas had taught her with his impossible letters and his decades-long vigil of love. Peace isn't something you find at the end of life. It's something you choose every single day. And courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to save yourself, even when it means disappointing others, even when it means taking the harder path, even when it means starting completely over. The lighthouse at Lighthouse Point still stands, dark and silent, overlooking the Atlantic. But to Margaret Ellis, and now to her children and grandchildren who've heard the story, it represents something different. Not abandonment, but transformation. Not loss, but love. Not an ending, but a beginning. Because some stories don't end when we think they do. Some stories continue in the choices we make, in the forgiveness we offer, in the courage we find to let go of the past and embrace what comes next. Thomas Ellis found his peace on the water, under endless skies, in the rhythm of the waves. But Margaret Ellis found hers in an abandoned lighthouse, in a stack of photographs, in the liberation of understanding, and the power of letting go. And perhaps that's the real gift we give each other, not the prevention of pain, but the promise that even in loss, even in absence, even in the longest silences, love remains. Love persists. Love finds a way. Once you hear this story, you'll never forget it, because it reminds us that it's never too late to forgive, never too late to understand, and never too late to find your own lighthouse, that place where your soul can finally rest, where you can finally breathe, where you can finally be at peace with who you are and who you've always been. The light may have gone out at Lighthouse Point, but for Margaret Ellis, a different kind of light had just begun to shine, the light of freedom, of grace, and of a life lived fully, finally, without the weight of unnecessary guilt. And that light, once kindled, would shine for the rest of her days.